The likelihood that my brother is going to survive this is slim to none. But I give you my word, I will not be the one to take his life. I wouldn't be able to look my nephew in the eye, knowing that I killed his father. This is Bedtime Stories Grown-Up Edition, Operation Anteater, Part 19. And child, when we left off, the triplets had found out about Sincere's dirty deeds. Janelle was in labor. Ron and Kane were found dead. All of Ezra's hard work was about to go down the drain because Celeste was not buying the story that the police had told her. It just didn't jive with her last conversation with Kane. In the middle of Anya's semi-celebration, she got a phone call from Celeste. And at some point in the conversation, Celeste profusely apologized for not telling Anya that she'd suspected that Ron and Kane were an item. Before Anya could sign a word or ask any questions, Celeste completely unloaded all she knew. She'd found Kane after the conversation she and Anya had, and Kane had confessed all. He told her about Ron and his friendship in college, how that friendship had become sexual, how before coming out in college, he'd given Ron an ultimatum, that Ron had chose to end things with him and continued dating the woman he'd been seeing, how they lost contact, ran into one another again at court in Louisiana, that Ron had told Kane that their situationship had ended. He'd never been with another man. He hadn't been with one before he'd gotten involved with Kane. He'd gotten married and had a son, but he'd never forgotten about Kane and never stopped loving him. He begged Kane to join the nonprofit, so Kane relocated to Dallas and joined the nonprofit only after Ron had told him that he and his wife were separated and going through a divorce. Kane said that the story was believable because Anya suddenly disappeared. She stopped showing up at the nonprofit, only attended meetings remotely and when absolutely necessary. And Ron started taking Kane on business trips. When Anya showed up at the nonprofit that day and served Ron with divorce papers, Kane confronted Ron, ended things, and quit. He moved back to his hometown in Louisiana. And recently, Ron had come to Louisiana and found him, explained that he hadn't really lied. He and Anya had really been separated when he said they were going through a divorce. The divorce just couldn't proceed because Anya was pregnant. And in the state of Texas, divorces couldn't be finalized while the wife was pregnant. And since Kane knew that to actually be true, he believed Ron's lie. Ron had begged Kane to return, showed him proof that the divorce was final, and Kane said he'd think about it. A few weeks earlier, when Ron had contacted him again, Kane said that he could forgive him for not telling him the full truth. But the only way he'd believe that he could trust Ron going forward was if Ron confessed all to Anya, resigned from the board of the nonprofit, and quit his job with Anya's family. Ron said that he couldn't do that. He'd be effectively coming out of the closet. The two hung up, and Kane thought that was the end. But then 2 days earlier, Ron had called Kane and said that he couldn't live without him, and he'd meet all of Kane's demands if Kane would agree to help him figure out how to tell Anya. So Kane got on a flight and flew to Texas. But first, he called Celeste and told her the whole story. And even if by some happenstance Ron had changed his mind in the 11th hour, that would not make Kane kill Ron and himself. Even if he did, it wouldn't have been because Ron had broke things off. Video evidence, suicide note and all. When Celeste told Anya that she was not letting this go, Anya signed that she understood, was sorry for Celeste's loss, and asked her to keep her posted. And then she hung up the phone, ran out of her house, and straight to Q's. When Anya was done recounting her conversation with Celeste, Q promised to handle everything. While all that was going on, everybody was whispering. Over at the main house, the grandmother crew had gotten word too. The murder-suicide was big news, and so was the fact that Ron was playing for the pink team. Miss Joyce had said, "I wonder if he was doing the bending or the one getting bent over." Mrs. Ali said that's disgusting and that's not any of our business. Mom Brenda said, "I don't know how that matters. I hate that the man couldn't just live in his truth. Maybe if he did, he'd still be alive." Mom Joyce said, "I wonder how Anya's dealing with all of this. Divorced or not, it's gotta be hard to learn that the man you married and had children with is no longer in the land of the living." Mrs. Ali said, "And to learn that he was gay. Y'all Christians are real interesting." Mrs. Ali is Muslim. Mom Brenda said, "What's that supposed to mean?" Mrs. Ali said, "The man just stood in church on Sunday and held his brand new daughter while she was dedicated to Christ. knowing full well that this is how he was living. Mom Brenda said they don't have gay Muslims. Never mind, I already know the answer to that. For the record, I highly doubt that King James could have ever predicted that the fast one he and those 47 scholars who he commissioned to translate the Word of God back in 1611 would have been used to confuse people the way that it has in this day and age. Especially considering that he himself was as gay as the day is long. When Mom Joyce asked if Mom Brenda was suggesting that the King James Version was inaccurate and that the scriptures that referenced homosexuality hadn't been accurately translated, Mom Brenda said, "Now, Joyce, how could God tell the Israelites to go into Canaan and kill everything moving, women and children included, right after giving Moses the 10 Commandments, one of which included, 'Thou shalt not kill'? Don't you think that commandment had to have said something else? Like, 'Thou shalt not kill unless,' followed by a whole list of exceptions?" When Mom Joyce concurred, Mom Brenda said, "Clearly something was lost or intentionally omitted from the translation." Now, if they got that part wrong, how difficult is it to believe that there are some other parts that they got wrong too? If for no other reason than to serve some agenda that we aren't aware of. Mom Joyce said, "That's probably why the word says to study, to show thyself approved." Mom Brenda said, "And rightly divide the word of truth." You cannot do that without studying the word in its original form. Then Mrs. Ali added, "And reading all of the holy books, not just the 66 that the Romans decided were fit for the Canaan." And Mom Brenda said, "And I'm with you when you're right." Meanwhile, in Miami, Sincere's flight had touched down. The Lopez soldiers who'd accompanied him had transferred him to the care and custody of the St. James soldiers on the ground. They'd also transferred the instructions that they'd received from Javier. Sincere was not to be let out of their sight. He was to be transported directly to the hospital where Janelle was in labor. He was to be under guard the entire time he was there. He was to be immediately transported back to the airstrip 24 hours after Janelle gave birth, whether he wanted to go or not. He was not to be provided any technology. No stops were to be made, and no stops were to be made between the airstrip and the hospital. Sincere had a full caravan of soldiers escorting him from the airstrip to the hospital. It almost looked like a presidential escort. And even that wasn't enough, because when the car containing him pulled up outside of the entrance to the hospital, before the vehicle could come to a complete stop, Sincere had jumped out, tucked, rolled, hopped up on his feet, and took off running like a track star. Because he was a track star. He'd been a high school and college All-American, basketball and track star, and it was still in him. He'd actually touched up on his skills while he was recovering from his injuries at the hands of Courtney. He'd ran full speed across hospital grounds before any of the soldiers could react. And because he'd run perpendicular to the vehicles, across the grass and into the brush, he had a healthy head start. There was no catching him in a car, and the soldiers who were already on the grounds of the hospital and able to pursue him on foot could not keep up with his footwork. He left them in the damn dust because he knew where he was going. When he came out on the other side of the tree line, he jumped right into a waiting vehicle. The vehicle immediately took off, and when the driver asked where to, Sincere said, "Miami International." Then he pulled out a burner phone and made a phone call. At the airport, he used that burner phone to purchase 3 airline tickets on 3 separate airlines to 3 separate cities: New York, D.C., and L.A. None of the flights that he'd booked were direct, though. So the 5 families would have to send soldiers to all of those destination cities and to the layovers. He was not going to make it easy for the 5 families to catch him. They were going to have to work hard. But he was going to work harder. Instead of heading to TSA, he headed to the rentable lockers, entered his code, and removed the backpack. Tossed the burner phone he'd been using and removed a brand new one from that backpack. Then he used that new burner phone to book a first-class direct flight to Boston under an alias and headed to the nearest restroom, where he entered as Sincere St. James and exited as that alias. He knew that even that wasn't enough. Had his brother still been in federal custody, it would have been. But with him out, all he was doing was buying himself time. And he knew his brother would give him that time, because his brother had a heart, and he wouldn't let him die without at least giving him a chance to see his first son born into the world. And that's what he was banking on. When Saint's phone rung inside Janelle's labor and delivery room, he already knew what was up. And he wasn't at all surprised when he stepped into the hall to take the call to find Emmanuel Lopez on the other line. He didn't hesitate to tell Manny that he needed to find somebody else to do it. When Manny asked him to leave the hospital and join the search for his brother, Saint said, "I told you that. My brother is the Five Families problem now, not mine. I'm not leaving Janelle's side to solve that problem for you." Several hours later, Saint and Star saw their nephew come into the world. And when Saint saw the delivery of the placenta, he was grossed out and a memory was sparked. He remembered Big Nate giving him that analogy, the one about young soldiers being like placentas. And he decided that that was a fine time for him to find out more about the jobs that placentas did, while Janelle cried holding her brand new baby boy, and Star comforted her. Saint was researching placentas, and when he learned that the placenta's job was to ensure that the baby got whatever it needed without any regard for the mother's needs, even if that meant compromising the mother's needs, he understood the analogy and what his job was. He was going to take his brother's seat at the table. He was going to help find his brother, but he was going to do it all on his terms, and he was going to shake the whole ish up. He was going to be a kingpin, and the St. James family and the Notorious Five Families were never going to be the same. While Janelle was transported to her recovery room, in the room that she would stay in with her baby until they were discharged, Saint called Manny back and said, "Follow every lead, no matter how stupid it seems, and send me every lead you get." Then he provided Manny with all of the aliases that he knew Sincere had, because he'd helped him develop them, and said, "If your men find him, have them keep him in their sights and keep me posted, and wait until I get there." Then he hung up with Manny and called the one person who he knew wanted Sincere's head on a platter more than he did. When Saint joined Janelle and his sisters in Janelle's new room, he reluctantly broke the news that not only had Sincere clearly missed the delivery, but he wasn't showing up. He said, "I thought about it and I couldn't come up with a good reason not to just tell you the truth, Janelle. You'd have figured out that he wasn't coming eventually. You either built for this or you ain't. According to Natalia, you built for this. If that's true, then you can handle what I'm about to tell you." Then he told her that Sincere had made himself public enemy number one, and the likelihood was that she was never going to see him again. But no matter what, he and his sisters, Natalia and Summer, would all be there for her and her son. His nephew would never be without family, and neither was she. She cried, they comforted her, and then she asked them to get out and send in Jerome. So they did. The next day, Sincere was laying back on a beach chair, enjoying a double shot of Hennessy, imagining what his son looked like. He'd absolutely wanted to be there when his son was born. He wanted nothing more than to see his son grow up and have the chance to be a father to him. But he knew his siblings. He knew his brother would stand in the gap for him, and his sisters would hold Janelle down. He also knew his brother would be coming for him, and he was going to ensure that by the time that happened, it was too late. But first, he needed to get some get back. By the time Saint picked up his trail, he'd have gotten his revenge, and he'd be in the win. Eventually, Saint and the families would give up their search. He'd be far, far away, and he'd find a way to reconnect with Janelle and his son. If he was lucky, she'd be willing to reunite with him and bring his son to wherever he landed. Until then, he planned to wreak havoc on the lives of everyone who'd crossed him, starting with LJ. Not because LJ was his greatest enemy, but because LJ had dealt the most recent and the most public blow to his fragile ego. He'd embarrassed him at the round table, and Q and Big Wood had participated. He had something up his sleeve for both them niggas too. But that had to wait, because while he was being held in that dungeon at the Lopez estate, Regina had fell in his lap. I've gotten ahead of myself, so I'm gonna have to go back. See, when Sincere was at Miami International, and he had booked that direct first-class flight to Boston under an alias and gone in that bathroom and turned himself into that alias, he didn't head to his gate to wait for the flight to take off. He booked a car to take him to a private suite in a VIP area, away from the hustle and bustle of the airport, where travelers could wait for their flights and be transported by chauffeured car directly to the airplanes right before takeoff. They could enjoy fine dining, top shelf liquor, spa services, movies, sporting events on big screen TVs, high-speed Wi-Fi, and much more. They could skip the line at TSA, be checked into their flights, and treated like royalty. And under his alias, Sincere had paid for all that. But he wasn't boarding the plane to Boston. He was waiting for a flight to arrive. 2 hours into his wait, a beautiful, full-bodied blonde walked into his private suite. She handed him a carry-on and said, "Enjoy your flight." She exited the private suite, and shortly thereafter, so did he. He approached the chauffeur stand and said, "There's been a change of plans. Take me to Arrivals." At Arrivals, he collected the bag that the blonde had checked when she boarded her flight from New York to Miami. Now, if you recall, Sincere was already disguised, but he took the blonde's carry-on and her checked bag into the nearest restroom. And when he came out, the only thing that was even remotely similar to his true identity or the alias that he'd already assumed was his height and complexion. Because while he was in that restroom, he shaved his head and his face, attached a fake auburn goatee, dyed his eyebrows, inserted contact lenses, and was wearing non-prescription glasses, along with completely different clothes. He exited the terminal and headed for the Hertz counter, where he picked up a waiting rental car that had been booked under the alias that matched his current appearance. Then he drove from Miami to Tampa, and then he boarded a flight headed to Mexico. And that's precisely where he was, sipping a double shot of Henny and people watching. Actually, Regina watching. Sincere knew women. He didn't know Regina all that well, but he knew that any woman who'd fly the coupe, drive an SUV pulling a U-Haul trailer from Texas to North Carolina, leave it there without even unloading it, and take an international flight to Mexico, was ripe for some get back of her own. He also knew men. And clearly he didn't know LJ all that well, but he knew there wasn't a man alive who wouldn't lose his ish when he and the whole world saw the execution of the plan he'd lined up for Regina. LJ was going to wish he'd never played with Sincere. See, Sincere had known that Catherine was up to something. He just wasn't sure what. He could have never guessed how much ish he was going to get himself in, but he'd seen how the Five Families operated, and he knew when he got Saint arrested in Paris that he was going to need an out plan, just in case. So while Catherine had him working on everything except the war with the traffickers, which was certainly a dead giveaway, he'd taken a little pit stop to his spot in New York, connected with a chick that he'd kept under wraps, gave her 2 locked pieces of luggage, a suitcase and a carry-on, an American Airlines gift card, and 10 G's in cash. Then he gave her the number to his throwaway, told her to lock it in, and that if he ever called from that number, she was to drop everything and take a flight to wherever he was, no questions asked, using that gift card and bringing that luggage. The agreement was that he'd give her another 10 G's if his plan worked, and she was amenable. Before he headed into the roundtable meeting on Saturday, he followed all the rules, made sure that he was unarmed, and hid that throwaway in his crotch. When everything seemed fine Saturday night, he didn't let his guard down, not fully. So Monday morning, when the roundtable reconvened, he did it all over again. And when he was patted down before he was taken to the dungeon of the Lopez estate, the soldier responsible for checking for weapons and other technology wasn't all that comfortable touching around his crotch area. It was clear that Sincere was packing, and it wasn't a pistol. And when he was on that private plane, headed to Miami, he'd asked to use the restroom, sent a quick text to one of his closest friends in the world, a friend who'd also been provided the number to his throwaway. When Sincere was planning for the eventuality that he'd need to escape the five families, he'd thought of everything. In addition to giving his closest friend the number to his throwaway, he also gave him multiple IDs with matching credit cards and passports, 5 G's in cash, and orders to drop everything, grab the items he'd given him, and pull up if he ever got a text message from the number associated with his throwaway. Sincere knew that that text message was a risky one. There were no guarantees that his friend would even receive it, that he'd even be somewhere where he could grab the go bag, or that he'd show up at the spot where he designated before the soldiers caught up to him. All Sincere could do was run and pray. Thank God his homeboy was in a position where he could drop everything, grab that bag, and pull up. And when Sincere got in that car, he didn't just call that chick in New York and have her get on the first thing smoking to Miami. He got that go bag from his homeboy. When Sincere was being held in the dungeon of the Lopez estate, he was already trying to concoct a plan to get the hell out of Dodge. As luck would have it, he'd heard his phone ring, and he'd heard Janelle's ringtone. So he wasn't surprised at all when the soldiers came to get him and take him to the Lopez airstrip. He'd asked where they were taking him, and he wasn't at all surprised when they refused to tell him, thinking by keeping the destination to themselves, they'd prevent him from concocting a plan. But it was too late for that, because his ringing phone wasn't the only thing he'd heard in the dungeon. He'd also heard several of the soldiers laughing and joking about the fact that Regina had packed up everything, put it all in a U-Haul, and left Dallas, all because LJ wouldn't take her back. Catherine, Q, Big Wood, and every other person who'd been a part of his training team had trained him well. And he was his father's son. So he was trifling, but he was kingpin level devious. So he used his training and his genetic predisposition for sneakiness to take advantage of what he knew about the five families. They would debrief the soldiers about the do's and don'ts, but to ensure that it didn't look like there was trouble in paradise, infighting, or the heads were having a difficult time controlling the rank and file, they never let on that he'd become persona non grata. He knew that the soldiers on the plane wouldn't have expected for him to have a phone, but the ones on the ground would probably not be as well informed, because they would be technically working for him, and dissension in the ranks was just a bad look. So in the backseat of the car, Sincere pulled out that throwaway, pretended like it was vibrating in his pocket, like he'd answered it, and like the person on the other end was asking him to access a file. He pretended like he didn't have enough bars to hold the conversation and access the file. So when he turned to the driver and asked him to provide him with the most recent entry in the file of Regina Johnson, the driver didn't think anything of it. And when he stopped at the red light, logged onto the server, and saw that the file was unsecured, he told him that the file showed Regina Johnson had just boarded a plane to Cancun. No one had told him not to give Sincere any information, that Sincere was no longer in charge, or that Sincere wasn't supposed to have a cell phone. They told him not to make any stops, not to allow Sincere to use his phone, and to keep his head on the swivel, just in case someone tried to intercept the vehicle. The vehicle was smack dab in the middle of the caravan, surrounded on all sides, and he had no reason to be concerned. Nothing about that situation changed until they pulled onto the hospital grounds. All of the vehicles had to travel in single file. So as Sincere watched Regina, he patted himself on the back for a plan well executed and contemplated how he'd implement the next phase. He figured he had time, because even if Saint had left Janelle in Miami, he would waste a whole lot of time between New York, DC, LA, Boston, and the layovers before he'd ever get to the alias that brought him to Cancun. What Sincere couldn't have predicted, though, was that Saint didn't follow any of those stupid leads. He questioned the driver of the vehicle that had taken Sincere from the airstrip to the hospital, and followed the lead that led Sincere to Regina. And Sincere's head start was dwindling. And Saint had returned to the hospital to see Janelle that morning. He found Jerome holding his nephew, Janelle looking on lovingly, and Jerome looking like a proud papa. Saint looked Jerome up and down, and Janelle said, "Sweetheart, can you give us a minute?" He handed her the baby, looked Saint square in the eye, and said, "I'll be in the waiting room." And as soon as he left, Janelle said, "Saint, please don't be a problem. That man has been good to me. And now that I've seen what a real man is, I am ready to move on from your brother." Saint didn't even respond. Instead, he said, "I'm about to head out. I need to go find my brother." Janelle said, "Are you going to kill him?" Saint said, "The likelihood that my brother is going to survive this is slim to none. But I give you my word, I will not be the one to take his life. I wouldn't be able to look my nephew in the eye, knowing that I killed his father. Janelle shed a tear or two, and then Saint shocked the hell out of her, saying, I'm willing to sign his birth certificate and raise him as my own. Janelle said, really? Why would you do that? How would Natalia feel about that? Saint said, because I'm not leaving my nephew out here without a father. Natalia and I discussed it last night. She understands. Then Janelle said, would you be offended if I asked Jerome to do that instead? Saint said, I'm in the middle of conducting a full background investigation on Jerome. If he passes, you have my blessing. Janelle said, oh, he's gonna pass. Catherine already did a background investigation on him. She even paid somebody to come on to him, and he ain't fall for it. Saint just shook his head. Janelle said, but if by some magic he doesn't pass your investigation, I'll take you up on that offer. Then Saint said, if anything come up, call my lady first. I need to go. Janelle thanked him profusely. She was appreciative that Saint and his sisters had dropped everything to show up for her and her son, especially considering that Sincere didn't. She said, I'm still pissed that your brother missed the delivery. I thought he was at least a better man than that. I really asked for so little from him, and he couldn't even put our son first.
Lord, if you listening, don't let me fold again. Break every time, they keep pulling me in, even if it hurt, let it in, hide it, so tight. I ain't even resting right, mind gone, I've been fighting every night. I prayed before, but I ain't let go, still held on tight to what hurt me the most.